All right, so while you're doing this, I can now officially state that our next speaker is Chara Vlachaki. And while waiting for your full title to be displayed, I can now tell you it's a Relevance theoretic model of aesthetic experience. And
So can you see my slides now? Can you see
yes,
the
we can.
presenter's notes as well, or is it just a slide?
I think we can see the right mode of your presentation. So please go ahead. The floor is yours, Chara.
Great. Thank you so much, Agnieszka. And thank you everyone for coming or staying to my talk. And of course, many thanks to Kate and Ryoko for organizing this conference. They're doing an amazing job in bringing everyone together as usual. So yeah, I'm Chara, as Agnieszka said. Very, very recently, I passed my Viva, actually 2 weeks ago. So in some ways, I'm still a PhD student at the University of Brighton. And my topic today is based on part of my doctoral thesis where I explore ineffability, non-propositionality, and the role of emotion in the aesthetic interpretation of art and aesthetic experiences. So what I will present today is a model that I proposed and illustrates how relevance theory can account for aesthetic experiences. So just to give a bit of context, which is always important, as we know in pragmatics, it all started with logic, and logic was so influential that it became the main tool to analyze meaning. And therefore, emphasis was placed on what can be either true or false, what we call as propositions or propositional content. And in the 1950s, we have the cognitive revolution, so basically cognitive science versus behaviorism, or as a response to behaviorism, if you like. So central to cognitivism was the idea that the mind processes information about the world through the manipulation of mental representations. And this cognitive turn was seminal in the development of relevance theory, which is the framework we all nice people work with. But this is not the only reason I'm doing a bit of time traveling, if you like. It's because during this movement, one of the key figures was David Marr, whose model I will discuss later, but it's important in terms of how I, let's say, structured the model I want to propose. So how do we take it from here? As I said, the main issue is the focus on propositions, but surely we can't deny that when we communicate, often there's something non-propositional, as we've seen with talks prior to mine. Think, for example, facial expressions or interjections, metaphors, your favorite poem, an artwork that left you speechless. So this is where descriptive ineffability comes, and ineffability is typically associated with words. The term is used to refer to these aspects of meaning, including thoughts and emotions that cannot be adequately paraphrased, they cannot be fully captured by words. So we're talking about something slippery, something vague. Now you might think, oh, well, is there a point of examining these cases when you don't have something, I don't know, tangible in a sense? In my humble opinion, it definitely is. And the ineffable is pervasive in everyday life. We have interjections, we have slurs, facial expressions, and all these convey much more. But the example I draw from is art and the experience we often have when we encounter artworks. And this is none other than aesthetic experience, which can occur in many different contexts. When, for example, we read a poem or a novel, when we listen to music, when we view a painting, a sculpture, and so on and so forth. And on that basis, I would like to draw a connection between art and communication. So art has much in common with everyday communication. I'm not trying to suggest that all artworks are communicative, of course. I guess it depends on what you define as art and what you define as communication. But art has indeed much in common with communicative acts. It conveys ideas and meanings. It has the ability to recall memories, initiate information processing. It can elicit affective responses, employ symbols, similar to other communicative acts. A medium is involved, and that's not necessarily words, especially if you think of nonverbal artworks. And art is expressive because through art, emotions are directly expressed, and that doesn't mean necessarily that there is an intention to communicate there. And yet, it seems there is a continuity between artworks and everyday communication. And I draw from Pinocchi here, who suggests that artworks are a case of metaphorical sewing, where the artist, what they do is metaphorically point the artwork to an audience. And on that note, something to think about on the communicative nature of art. And where does it fit in this continuum, is the non-mentalistic ostension that Sperber and Wilson are proposing in their latest paper, which, according to this basic ostension, as they call it, the speaker provides the audience with a direct observational evidence. And the example they use as well as pointing, so maybe there is a kind of overlap with Pinocchi there. But I believe that in many ways art fits in this new category. So the question remains: how do we deal with ineffability in relevance theory? And of course, there is much literature in descriptive ineffability, but I'm thinking more in the relations between affect and ineffability. And there's a recent affective turn the last few years. But for the purpose of this presentation, I want to focus solely on the tools that come with the theory, namely cognitive effects and affective effects. So, as you know, the theory is built around relevance and the balanced relationship between processing effort and cognitive effects. Pardon me. So a stimulus is relevant when processing that particular stimulus requires less or the least effort. And this processing yields a good amount of cognitive effects. The more, the better. Of course, there is nothing wrong with traditional good old relevance theory, but the question to think about is what happens with art? Are cognitive effects enough? Is the relationship balanced? And if anything, sometimes it's not balanced, but they're still worth it. So we still allocate energy and attention. So what happens there? So this imbalance that we can find in the aesthetic interpretation of art can be addressed by an interplay between cognition and affect, often in the form of a cognitive affective loop. We feel and we entertain thoughts, and we feel. And the notion of affective effects was initially introduced by Wharton and Stray and was later refined in the latest book by Wharton and Associates. And whereas initially for Wharton and Stray it was emotional effects, now we have the term affective effects, which can be divided into two categories, which I will explain in the next two slides. But the purpose of this figure is to see this cognitive affective loop between cognitive and affective effects. So primary affective effects, they do not involve a search of relevance. They are precursors to inference and consequently to cognitive effects. They are further divided into two categories, anticipatory and transfer effects. And anticipatory are the ones that set into motion cognitive processes. There is an anticipation of a course of action. And transfer effects occur when we communicate information about our emotional states to each other. And that's in line with the notion of emotional contagion. Pardon me. So secondary affective effects are an extra product of communication. So to yield secondary affective effects, we need interpretation of utterance or something that is caused by propositions. An example that Wharton and Saussure use is literature and how secondary affective effects arise based on memories that the reader has, memories that simulate, remind the reader of an affective experience that they're reading about. And these function as anchors, so they can imagine how it is to be part of that situation. Secondary affective effects make certain things relevant. They're triggered by descriptions of situations, sequence of events, but also psychological states of individuals, and they're processed with regard to the reader's cognitive and psychological environment. So with these tools in mind, cognitive and affective effects, and the framework of relevance theory as you know it, I would like to move on to the model I'm proposing. But first I will allude to Mar's model of vision, since my model is based on his. So his proposal was to understand the cognitive system and cognitive processes. We must acknowledge three systems loosely related to each other, so they work together. So he distinguished between computational, algorithmic, and the implementation level. So in the first level, the computational, it's about what the cognitive system does and why it does it. So any potential problems that there might be here and what the system has to do to overcome the problems. The algorithmic tries to solve the problems by trying to identify steps or rules, any processes. So we have representation and procedures required at this stage become more explicit. As for the implementation level, this offers an explanation of how both algorithmic and it offers an explanation of how the algorithmic processes are physically realized. So we're talking about neural mechanisms and structures. In this level, Mar examines neurons, neural circuits, and other physiological structures. So the model I would like to propose is a combined model of Mar and relevance theory, which could explain how viewers process aesthetic stimuli through visual perception and inferential reasoning, balancing effort and effects. And I'm saying it's a combined model of Mar because it's the idea that you have different levels that they all work together. So they're all intertwined, working towards the end result. So the first level, which in some ways it maps to the computational, what you have is the viewer encounters the aesthetic object, a painting, a sculpture, for example, and its ineffable elements. They might select the features that are relevant to them. They might process basic visual properties such as color, shape, and texture. Depending on how salient a feature is, but also to the extent the viewer is subjectively drawn to what they consider more relevant, the artwork attracts the attention of the viewer. So in this level, the viewer might also experience some kind of affective reaction without any search of relevance. There's no inferencing involved at this stage. So potentially we're talking about primary affective effects. Whether these are anticipatory or transfer depends entirely on the stimuli, on the artwork, the viewer, and the context the aesthetic experience occurs. In relation to the algorithmic level, we have the states that's characterized by any structural or spatial understanding that occurs in addition to inferential processing. So as the viewer moves forward and through different stages of visual processing, they oscillate between automatic visual processing and inferential work. They might allocate attention to the relationship between different visual elements. They might consider symmetry or complexity of the structures, and any other parameters that they deem as relevant. The organization of visual elements and what is visually perceived as relevant has the ability to amplify or dampen even the initial affective response. Maybe they have any prior experiences that they are triggered or previously held assumptions, and these interact with the meaning of the artwork as perceived by the viewer. So if that is the case, then at this stage what we have is the viewer will form any hypothesis about intended meanings and consequently form representations. So the cognitive effects, which will be yielded here, will trigger secondary affective effects, and we might have an emotionally loaded interpretation. You can see that there's no map between implementation level because relevance theory is not concerned with neurological evidence. And I have a short hypothetical scenario to make the model hopefully more clear. So I hope that you can see on the slide one of Monet's paintings. Of course, that's an image. So supposedly you visited Paris and Musée d'Orsay, and you are initially drawn by the soothing colors from this vivid palette of greens, purples, blues, and pinks. You are not amongst the crowd. The museum is very quiet, so you're very lucky. You're being attracted by the loose brush strokes that they create a sense of movement. The surface of the water is shimmering, and the lilies appear floating, evoking possibly a sense of serenity and peacefulness, so have primary affective effects. And this almost abstract composition, with the lines blurred, draws your attention to the water garden. And you might recognize the water lilies floating. The sense of tranquility deepens, reinforced by this spatial harmony, if you like. And you stand in front of the painting, you contemplate further, you reflect on the passage of time, on the transient nature of beauty, cognitive effects. And this adds an extra level to the emotional depth. So we have secondary affective effects. But of course, you might not like Monet, and his work won't catch your attention. But something else will though. So just some concluding remarks. I always like to go back to this quote that Tim used a lot as well, because every time I read it, it intrigues me. So trying to tackle down how inference operates over non-propositionalities is definitely not an easy task, as per Ben Wilson point in Relevance. And the interpretation of artworks, I believe, falls into this area of non-propositionality, especially if you consider how central the role of affect is in the aesthetic interpretation of this type of meaning that we find in artworks. The notion of mentalistic ostension, I believe, paves the way to examine art in a wider range of communicative acts. And let us not forget that a relevance theory offers a unified account of examining communication. So why art is not there? Artworks can aesthetically move us, and to be able to examine this type of experience through the relevance theory illustrates not only the merits of the framework, but also highlights the role of emotion and cognitive processes. And last but not least, I know I'm overrun almost by a minute. The model illustrates how affective responses occur in tandem with visual processing and inferencing, leading to the end result, an aesthetic experience triggered by ineffability. So thank you. And here are my references. I cannot see anyone, so I could stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Hara. Thank you for your most interesting presentation, beautifully illustrated with examples that I believe appealed to many of us aesthetically and not propositionally. Are there any questions or comments? Right, so I can see Ellie is raising her hand.
Yes, hi, Hara.
Hi.
Thank you. Long time no see. Thank you for the very interesting talk. Going back to your slide on your model of aesthetic experience.
Am I still
yeah,
sharing my screen?
No, don't worry. Even if you can't do that, I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit on where at different stages that perhaps you were presenting on that slide, at which point or at which stage would you expect inference to start actually, taking place?
Yeah,
Maybe.
so that's a good question.
If you have any ideas on that, because you've mentioned inference. So since we're talking here about mostly non-propositional types of effect, maybe it would be interesting to reflect a bit on that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question, actually. When I suggested the model, I think I always struggle with the word stages, although I use it because it's not linear. But what I think in terms of inferencing,
I mean, for example,
what I would suggest.
For example, you mentioned primary, secondary, affective.
Yeah, so the primary would be in the equivalent, let's say, to the computational stage because they occur before any inferencing. But then these might, in the terms of the cognitive affective loop that I talked about, then you might have cognitive effects where you contemplate even further when you view an artwork. Then you have secondary affective effects, and that creates a kind of loop. Emotions become intertwined with our thoughts. I mean, as I said with the example with Monet, it might not appeal to everyone, but I think there must be something that it's relevant to the viewer that a similar process occurs. So I think the inference works when we have the cognitive effects and then these kind of trigger secondary affective effects.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions to Hara? Well, actually, I have a question. So if I may,
used to it now.
I'm presuming that that you are using the notion of weak communication when it comes to interpreting arts and artworks. But would you say that well, strong communication may also be affected by the use of artworks? I'm thinking of some artworks with, like a clear message, like artwork for the sake of some kind of activism, or that sometimes the message can be very, or maybe not very, but rather specific. So it could be in terms of strong or stronger implications. Well, definitely not Monet, but
yeah, I can see what you mean. I guess with something very specific, we have a specific context. But I'm thinking, as long as you are aware of that context, these assumptions are part of your context, you might still have a vaguer interpretation. So I haven't thought about it, to be honest, but I'm thinking if there is a clear-cut meaning, then you might say that it's a strong communication, but at the same time, it might not. I think it's something to think about. It's a good point.
yeah,
But I would say it depends on the context that it's presented.
Like some
But if, for example,
yes, sorry, I keep interrupting you, but
no.
share an example, like what you're thinking about some anti-war picture, right? So, but I think there's quite a number, right? So I was thinking that sometimes this idea of focusing only on weak communication may not. So I'm trying to add something to for your case of that actually artworks are communicatives and not necessarily in the weakest sense. So the idea.
Yeah, I can see the point. And when you said anti-war, I mean, it's kind of similar. What I thought is, I think it was a mural that I saw at one of the museums in Bristol, and it had to do with Black Lives Matters. There weren't words there, but it was clearly for because I had this sculpture, I can't remember the scholar that apparently his culture was against the whole idea of Black Lives Matter. And there was this scene in the mural, and kind of the message was clear, but I think maybe that starts, I don't know, you go from strong to weak. Maybe there is still another loop there. So it's something to think about. Thank you. It's a really good point.
Well, thank you so much. I can see that two more questions appeared. So if I'd like to give floor to Tim first.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you, Chara. That was really interesting. It's incredibly ambitious, what you're trying to do. And I mean, it ties in with, well, it ties in a little bit with the answer I gave to Stavros's question about, he was asking, how do you think this whole picture fits together? And it's not really a question, Chara, so I'm sorry about that. It's just something that occurred to me. So one of the things I've been working on recently with Patricia Colaiti is this issue of selectivity. So it's the issue of why things that are kind of have very little utilitarian value among humans, such as art and literature, why they are relevant to us, why do we direct our mental lives to them so much, given that they have no kind of practical value? And I think the answer lies in the fact that they are extremely relevant to us, which chimes with something that Tom said about, the importance of this notion of relevance and how it kind of crosses over a whole range of disciplines. So this is just a suggestion, really, a literature for you to explore. Is this issue of selectivity. You're providing a model of what happens, or you're working towards a model of what happens when a human, when a person looks at a piece of art, and you're trying to understand the processes. But there's a bigger question, which is, why is it relevant? What does it do for us? I suspect the answer is that Patricia and I talk about in the book is that humans are not we are cognitive organisms, but cognition extends far beyond the skull, as it were, and it extends in all kinds of areas. And I think, I know you're thinking about a monograph based on your PhD. I think a chapter on the whole issue of selectivity. Why is art everywhere? Why do we persist with it? Why is it so important to us? I think that's an issue that would be really worth exploring and would feed into your work, which is more on a kind of micro level. Sorry, that's not a question. That's just me
It's
sharing
okay.
something.
Always appreciate.
Thank you. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much again. I can see we have two more questions. I think we can spare like a few minutes and shorten the lunch break. So I think Meng Yang was the next person in line. Hello, are you there? Could you please ask your question? Well, if not, maybe then Fabrizio.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Chara. Beautiful speech. As you know, I love your work. I was just thinking, also off the cuff, from Tim's intervention. You know, there's so much about verbal communication that's culture specific, and on the contrary, there's so much about emotions that are universal, right? So, you know, contempt, disgust, enjoyment, they're there because they're needed to survive. So obviously, you know, something biological and you know, very much at the heart of what we need to be in order to survive. I think if you know, you'd be interested in some intercultural studies research on this. You know, if you could add that extra layer to your research and tap into intercultural studies, it would be really interesting, just to prove that what you're doing with nonverbal and emotions is actually more universal, and there's a value that's beyond, you know, it's much more universal than what we do with language, with verbal communication. I don't know whether.
No, so thank you, Fabrizio, and thank you for your kind words. I mean, I haven't really thought about intercultural communication and studies in terms of, from my perspective, when I think of relevance theory, this is included somehow. It's part of the assumptions that we have, you know, any assumptions we might have regarding certain artworks might be influenced, you know, from our culture, but we're looking at that from a cognitive perspective. So I haven't thought of that, to be honest. It's something, you know, to think about, but I always thought that it was kind of integrated in a way in the overall framework of relevance theory as part, you know, because when we're talking about context, for example, that includes the assumptions as well, doesn't it? So yeah, it's something to Tim is saying something in the comments. Oh, I don't remember that, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's something to think about. Thank you. Always welcome new comments and suggestions. I don't know if Meng Yang is back, and I'm happy to answer the question unless everyone wants to go to the lunch break.
So sorry. I was actually just about to speak when Zoom just suddenly crashed on my phone. Sorry, I've got someone in the same room, so I'll be keeping my camera switched off. First of all, lovely seeing you. Big congratulations on finishing your Fiverr. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to make it really quick. It's actually pretty much in the same direction as the comments Tim just mentioned, because when I was looking at your presentation, which is great, but I was at the same time thinking, how or if it could be tied in some way to Patricia's work on perceptual effects. But she's also done quite a lot of research on art appreciation and interpretation. But I suppose she's focusing more on the perceptual aspect of it. So I was wondering if your model could be tied into her model, and if so, in what ways would that be possible?
So from what I read from Patricia's work, I've read a bit about her notion of perceptual effects, which to me it sounds a bit like affective effects. So yeah, as you're saying, I agree. She focuses more on perception. Again, I haven't thought about it, how we can include her work in the actual model. I mean, as part of the literature, yes, definitely is to be considered. But in terms of, I think potentially I could look more into perception, and that could also include Patricia's work. That's what I can think out of the blue now. So yeah, I don't know if that was your question, Manyang, or if I went another way.
Well, yes, in some way it is, because you also mentioned like attention would be allocated in what audience find most relevant, which I presume would implement some sort of perceptual cohort, so to speak. So yes, that's a very interesting thing to think about. Thank you for that.
Thank you for the questions.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for the questions.
I think it's time to thank everyone for the participation in this section. So thank you so much again, all the three speakers. Your talks were great, and thank you so much for the questions. And we'll see each other soon after the break. So thank you so much again.